All right. Ladies and gentlemen, representatives from the diplomatic community, friends, guests, my name's James Batley from the ANU's Department of Pacific Affairs, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event to launch the book, The China Alternative. We have a good number of people with us here in person at ANU, but we've also got many dozens of people Zooming in and registered on Zoom from many parts of the world today. So we welcome all of you who are participating. To get us underway, I'd like to invite Auntie Violet Sheridan to welcome us to country.
What a pleasure it's been here this morning to form a welcome to country and welcome you on the land of the Ngunnawal people. As I've just been told, I'm a Ngunnawal elder. My people have lived in this country for in this part of the country for many years until they decided to make this Canberra, the capital city of Australia, where my family and the other Ngunnawal families was actually pushed out. We ended up out in Yass area and around in the region and in Queanbeyan. My great-great-grandmother, if you're familiar with the area around Yass and Boorowa, in between Yass and Boorowa, there's a little place called Rye Park. And my grandmother and families have lived there as well. So they built a mud hut there and they reared 12 children in that little mud hut, and it still stands today. So I've got I'm a very spiritual person, and Canberra has a good feeling for me. It's a lovely place. Some suburbs around, I don't like going because I always get to think, what happened here? Something, because I get a bad feeling. So it is my pleasure to be here to welcome you all this morning. I believe that a welcome to country is a traditional Aboriginal blessing, symbolising the traditional owners and giving consent to an event taking place on the land. And it also shows respect for the first peoples of the land you are meeting on. I suppose it's a little bit not going to someone else's house unless you're invited or welcomed. I'm a proud Ngunnawal woman as I walk into the future, teaching the next generations about the oldest culture in the world, the Aboriginal culture. And I'd like to pay my respects to my elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in the room. And also like to acknowledge all the non-Indigenous people as well, all the speakers here today. And keeping in the general spirit of friendship and reconciliation, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here this morning on behalf of my family and the other Ngunnawal families. God bless you all. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Auntie Violet, for that generous welcome. Well, it's a bit of an understatement to say that the book that's being launched today is a timely book. It has its origins in a two-day workshop and public seminar that was held in Port Vila, Vanuatu, back in February 2019. One of the people that spoke at that event was Vanuatu's then Foreign Minister, the Honourable Ralph Regenvanu. And we're honoured to have Mr. Regenvanu with us today by Zoom to launch the book. Now, Mr. Regenvanu is a graduate of this university in the fields of anthropology and development studies. And no mata hemi young falayet, he has a long and distinguished career as a leader, both outside and inside politics in Vanuatu and more broadly in the wider region. He's currently leader of the opposition in the Vanuatu Parliament, and I'm delighted to invite him to launch this book today. So, Honourable Ralph, over to you.
I would like to acknowledge all the dignitaries and people who are attending this launch, colleagues and friends from the diplomatic community, from the academic community, fellow public administrators, friends from the media, members of the Pacific interested community, and all of those that are participating virtually from around the world. First of all, thank you, James Batley, for the introduction. Thank you, Thomas. Good to see you again. And thank you also to the elder who made the acknowledgement of country and welcomed us and allowed us to speak on the land of her ancestors. And I just want to say here that I am most excited about the new Australian government's pledge to provide a constitutional place for Indigenous Australians. And I'm greatly looking forward to the rollout of the First Nations foreign policy that has also been announced. Australia's geographic location and long history as one of the Black Islands is an important foreign policy lever that has not been fully exploited by Australia until now, and I welcome it. I also want to say a thank you to the Department of Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University and the Centre for Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and especially the editors Graham Smith and Terence Wesley Smith for the invitation to launch this volume, which I'm very honoured to do. My invitation to launch this book follows on from the invitation that was extended to me when I was Vanuatu's Foreign Minister in 2019, where I was asked to speak at the opening of the symposium called the China Alternative, Changing Regional Order in the South Pacific, in the Pacific Islands Symposium. And this was held at Emelis Campus, the Port Vila campus of the University of the South Pacific in February, as James said. We often don't get such high-level academic symposiums in Port Vila. So many of us in Port Vila were very excited by the event and the host of distinguished speakers and participants who were in town. And I want to make a special acknowledgement to the organizers of that event for hosting it in Vila at our university. I hope we see much more of such arrangements in the future. I also want to acknowledge and thank Dame Meg Taylor, the former Secretary of the Pacific Islands Forum, who was the other opening speaker along with me at the symposium. She can't be with us today, but I would like to thank her for what she said at that time and her participation and coming to Vanuatu for that symposium. And I also want to acknowledge one of her new roles as a regional champion for Vanuatu's initiative to obtain an International Court of Justice advisory opinion by a vote of the General Assembly this year on the issue of the legal implications of climate change. Vanuatu is hoping very much to get the support of the Pacific Islands Forum at the upcoming Leaders Summit in the coming weeks for this General Assembly vote, given that the Caribbean states via CARICOM have already announced the support. So for those who don't know me, I've been Member of Parliament for Port Vila for the past 14 years. I'm in my 4th legislature now, and I've been Leader of the Opposition, as James said, since the last general elections in 2020. So back in 2019, as Foreign Minister, I was delighted to have been approached to make the opening remarks at the symposium for a number of reasons. Firstly, it was a collaboration between two of the great Pacific studies institutions of our region, which have been producing some of the best research on the Pacific for many years. And also it was being held at our own great regional institution, the University of the South Pacific. Secondly, it intended to produce scholarship towards producing the book that we're launching today, which essentially was made in the Pacific at my hometown at this symposium, and that foregrounded Pacific voices and some of the region's leading thinkers. Thirdly, the region was desperately in need of more research on how the so-called regional order was changing due to China's growing presence. As a Pacific leader, it sometimes seemed as though headlines in Australian newspapers were driving the policy response to China's presence among policymakers in all states throughout the region. We sorely needed a more nuanced and constructive information base based on grounded research, which is always the best source of evidence for building policy. And I believe this is a very important contributor in this sense. The workshop for the book was in Vanuatu in 2019, at a time when Vanuatu was still at the center of a debate about whether China was going to build a base in the Pacific at Luganville, our second town. I still remember distinctly waking up in my Sydney airport hotel room in transit back from the Summit of the Non-Aligned Nations, turning on the TV and seeing headlines across all the channels announcing a new Chinese military base in Vanuatu, much to my surprise. So my opening remarks in the book reflect on that time, and I would just like to bring out some of the main points I made then, which I think still apply. I said the obvious point is that the dynamic and complex geopolitics that are purported to be changing the regional order in the Pacific are simply reflective of international geopolitics and the paradigm and ideological shifts that happen as the dominant world states pursue their own national interest. And for a small island developing state such as Vanuatu, these shifts provide opportunities for our own national interest. And what I said then was that Vanuatu's national interest is the successful implementation of our own Vanuatu National Sustainable Development Plan 2016 to 2030, also known as the People's Plan 2030, which is the country's vision and overarching policy framework for achieving, and I quote, a stable, sustainable, and prosperous Vanuatu over the next 15 years. Now it's 10 years. Our locally developed adaptation of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. So basically, resourcing our own sustainable development is our key national foreign policy objective. I also made the point that Vanuatu is consistently ranked as the country in the world most susceptible to natural hazards. And this point was made very clearly last week when we had an out-of-season cyclone, which caused some of the worst flooding we've experienced in Port Vila, including that famous shot of the national airline sitting on a sea, which was essentially the airport tarmac covered with water. First time in living memory. I also made the point that notwithstanding the perceived unorthodox means by which China's continued assistance towards Vanuatu's development priorities and aspirations is manifested, the simple fact is that this assistance is meeting a development need or priority. At the time, I also welcomed the Australian Pacific Step Up, which had recently been announced, and the New Zealand Pacific Reset. They had just been announced before that time. And I also welcomed the intention of the United Kingdom to reopen a High Commission in Vanuatu, and the government of Japan to establish for the first time ever an embassy here in Port Vila. And I'm pleased to announce that both those, the High Commission and the embassy, are now well and truly up and running and fully staffed, and we're very honored to have them here with us. But I think perhaps the most important point I made in my in that speech was my key stated priority since becoming foreign minister just over a year ago is to push reforms in the government's internal workings to strengthen Vanuatu's capacity to be clear in knowing what it needs from the international community and to be able to strategically articulate these needs to the partners who will assist us. Obviously, our main imperative, as for any country, is national interest. But in terms of what I said at that time, I believe one of the key questions that needs to be examined or perhaps teased out when discussing the regional order, as we will be today, is what is the national interest? How is it determined? And how is it emphasized differently by different political elites in our countries? And how is it sometimes manipulated and at times even abandoned? The purported national vision. What accounts for purportedly unexpected outcomes, as we recently saw with the Solomon Islands Security Agreement example? And the recent change of government in Australia is also an interesting case study of this dynamic in action. People who have been following my career know that my overarching objective as a political leader in Vanuatu has been to improve our inherited Western democracy, to improve the way in which Vanuatu governs itself. In all the elections I've participated in, all my election posters, the first and headline item is always political reform. It's an imperative, or it is my imperative, to improve the nature of our democracy, to continue the process of localizing or indigenizing it, to become fit for purpose, for as accurately as possible reflecting and implementing the so-called will of the people. In Vanuatu, and I believe in most of the Pacific, our state institutions are still very weak and nascent. And building those based on the values, and for Vanuatu, the values are very clearly stated in our constitution, traditional Melanesian values, faith in God and Christian principles, is a constant process. So I want to encourage the editors and authors to make their research and the papers in this volume more accessible for policymakers, but also the general public, in the Pacific Islands, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, in the metropolitan centres of Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and others. I echo the call that has been made by many academics for greater Pacific literacy in the metropolitan centres. And I think that perhaps this is my greatest wish for this volume, that it be used to build that Pacific literacy in those metropolitan centres, as well as being, and I encourage the authors to also make it more accessible to the people in the Pacific Islands. And when I was in charge of research at the Cultural Centre, we always said, make it accessible to the level of high school leavers. That is what we term to be the general public level of accessibility. So with those calls, I'm very honoured and I'm delighted to declare this book launched, and I wish you all the best in today's deliberations. Thank you.